So, what happens when you decide to give a studio that is mostly known for chibi comedy stories access to an anime about an unfortunate soul forced to rule the fictional kingdom from their favorite MMO? An anime about an atheistic businessman sent to a magic-infused representation of the Great World War. A depressing story about a boy forced to go on an adventure with nothing but his allies and his ability to reawaken upon death. And a comedy that parodies shows just like the previous three I just mentioned. You get 3 seasons and a movie. Not only that, a movie with a release in theaters. Okay, a theatrical release, that's great. It's called Isekai Quartet, and it parodies Overlord, Re:Zero, Konasuba, and Youjo Senki, which I should mention I will be referring to by its Japanese name, as opposed to its English name, which is Saga of Tanya the Evil, to avoid confusion, allowing me to call it something a little bit shorter, and also so it's not literally just the name of the character that is the protagonist. And I should go ahead and step back for a second, because it's actually surprising how well written Isekai Quartet actually is. Other shows similar to it, chibi spin-offs of pre-existing franchises that you're meant to take seriously, tend to not actually be that interesting. I know a lot of people love the Naruto spin-off, the one that focuses on Rock Lee, but then you have Attack on Titan Junior High, which doesn't treat any of its characters correctly and feels like they're nothing more than parodies of themselves, which sounds like it would make sense and is a right thing to do, but Isekai Quartet doesn't feel like the characters are parodies. It feels like the characters are in a story that is a parody, and they are just simply the original characters, except maybe turned up to 11. And it's great. Now I should go ahead and mention that this is not the first time that Studio Puyukai, the studio that has actually gone ahead and make Isekai Quartet, actually made a parody of an existing isekai. In fact, this is the 3rd time that they have made a parody of one of the 4 shows that is currently present. Before even starting to work on Isekai Quartet, they already had experience with both Overlord and Youjo Senki, due to being the studio behind Pleiades and Youjo Senki, which are of course spin-offs of their respective series. Before anything else, let me get some final intro stuff out of the way. Firstly, I will be spoiling Isekai Quartet pretty leniently. However, I will not be mentioning any of the shows referenced in later seasons, as some shows do get added on in Season 2 and Season 3. If I mention a show, it'll be one of the original 4, as well as I'll avoid any kind of spoilers to the original shows that they come up from. The only exception to this is at the very end of the video I'll talk about some Overlord lore that might be deemed a spoiler, but I'll have an entire section basically saying stop watching if you want to avoid the spoilers. So hopefully you can, avoid being spoiled. Next up, to make things a little bit easier to digest for everyone and to make sure we're all on the same page, let me quickly explain the plot of the 4 stories that are actually the main focal points: Overlord, Re:Zero, Tanya the Evil, and Konasuba, starting with the show that actually got the studio behind Isekai Quartet to even work on any of these shows. Let's start with Overlord. Momonga was a big fan of one of the most popular dive MMOs out there,
Yggdrasil.
Momonga played until the very last moment when the servers were supposed to be shut down permanently, but he didn't get booted from the game. No, instead Momonga found himself stuck within the game and all the NPCs gained sentience. This would include the residents of Nazarick, his followers. Learning this information, Momonga dons the name of his old guild and searches for any other potential players, now calling himself Eins Al Gun, the ruler of the Tomb of Nazarick. Technically, our protagonist is actually unnamed. He's just a salaryman from a 2011 Japan who does his job with a smile. That is, until a man he fired decided to push him into an oncoming train. Just before this poor soul meets a gruesome end, he's given a chance, an interaction with a higher being. With faith, the salaryman can be saved. Yeah, no. In a world with an unbound amount of information and no reason for someone as great as him to experience suffering, death is fine, because he knows what will come after death. That is, until the higher being in question changes his afterlife. The salaryman perishes, but instead of heaven or a black void or whatever else was expected, he awakened in an old nunnery, and the nuns called him Tanya. Tanya van de Gurdachev was reborn in a world that mirrors a World War I era Germany, but with magic. And to prove she doesn't need the variable she calls being X, she joins the military and fights for a peaceful life, no matter what other allies are forced under her heel. Anyone is an enemy of Tanya. But what's even worse than that is to be an enemy of the Empire. Subaru Natsuki was a pretty ordinary man. He lived in a modern-day Japan and did whatever needs or social shut-ins would normally do. Sounds boring, right? Don't worry, things are gonna get spicy. That is when he realizes his world has completely changed. A new friend by the name of Emilia makes her appearance and Subaru realizes his world is entirely fantastical. It's a pretty simple premise made more interesting by just how plain Subaru is, as well as his unique power. Return by Death is the staple ability he possesses, though he gains other powers in his authorities later on, and Return by Death is best described as respawning after he is killed, returning to a quote-unquote save point from before he died. There's plenty of specific details and rules that I won't go into detail just simply because there's a lot of them, but the point is still made. Using this power, Subaru intends to become Emilia's greatest supporter, doing whatever he possibly can for her. Sometimes people go through some pretty embarrassing situations, but look at the bright side. At least you didn't die because you mistook a truck for something. I'm gonna be honest, I don't even remember. I just remember it was really dumb. And that's the point. Because our protagonist for Konasuba is a bit on the unique side, Kazuma Sato, and when he dies, he is offered the opportunity to be reincarnated into another world by a supposed goddess, Aqua. She says she's the water goddess, but honestly, it's really hard to believe this because she just kinda sucks at everything. Not to worry though, in this new world, Kazuma has some incredible allies. Darkness, a masochistic warrior with no accuracy, and Megumin, who is a mage who finishes in a single shot and then is out of mana. Okay, so the entire team is terrible, but on the bright side, it's not like Kazuma is carrying them. He's terrible too. They're all terrible. And yet they're supposed to defeat some sort of evil king. Yeah, this is gonna go horribly wrong. And if you can't tell, this one specifically is a parody and a joke based off of other similar isekai anime, with Isekai Quartet being a parody of a parody. It is worth mentioning these shows have a variety of different backgrounds, different authors, different publishers. I think the only thing they have in common is the anime's publishing process. Well, even different studios made the anime adaptations. For example, Overlord is done by Madhouse, famous for such things as the first season of One Punch Man. They also did Black Lagoon. White Fox did ReZero, who's, from what I've seen, only really famous for ReZero. And Konasuba is done by Dean, which means this is the second video I get to talk about Higurashi, because they've also made Higurashi. At least the first Higurashi was made by Studio Dean. And as for Youjo Senki, wait, give me a second, I actually don't have Youjo Senki's. Give me a second. Okay. I don't know if I believe this. Who names their studio Nut? Oh, and it's apparently because they are nuts to make anime. That is the worst name I have ever heard for an anime studio ever. I love it. But whatever. That's not important. What's important is my main point. These are made with completely different backgrounds, and because of that you might not think they would blend well. I mean, aside from them being isekai, they're also completely different genres as well. But that's actually what makes it so fascinating. watching a character from a story as serious that tells more psychological stories with bigger themed questions, like Overlord putting a character that's morally good in the shoes of a character that's morally evil, or Tanya just being evil. There's no moral debate about it, she's just a bad person. In the same room as the party trick goddess from Konasuba. This actually ends up being a much funnier project, just simply because they shouldn't blend together, but they do. Okay, let's get the biggest plus out of the way quickly. This parody feels like it was made by legitimate fans who genuinely love the original source material. Not just the anime either, I mean there is references to the light novels. For example, and also before I say anything, yes, I know Overlord was technically a webcomic first, but we're talking about the light novels. I mean, the webcomic didn't even have Albedo, the deuterologist of modern Overlord. What I mean is that there's references that fall under the kind of if you know type of joke that were moments that just straight up weren't even in the anime at the time of the season releasing, namely for Overlord and Re:Zero. Also, there's quieter scenes that give more of an emotional weight than just a quick laugh. Yeah, some jokes are surface level, like for example there's a one-sided beef between Tanya and Aqua since Aqua claims to be a goddess, but there's also deeper cut references, like there being a wine bottle brand referencing the original name for Operation Revolving Door from Youjo Senki, Operation Rot Go. Heck, they even reference Kyohyuko from Overlord of all characters. That is absurdly deep, even by Overlord fan standards, and to the point of I feel like I shouldn't mention too much about him because it might be deemed spoiler territory. My point is the people making this show clearly is a fan of the 4 shows that make up it, and it very clearly shows. Though I will say there is a pretty clear-cut bias towards Overlord. My guess is a combination of a personal familiarity with the show, since it was the first one that they parodied out of this group, but also the world building existed in the series at the time of Season 1's release, to a level that was kind of above the other 3. Especially because other shows seem to get more spotlight once we get to future seasons, like referencing the famous shuffle monologue from Tanya, or listing every single ability Reinhardt has from Re:Zero, and apparently, from what I've seen in all of my research, they're mostly real, which is hysterical because they're also really dumb. The show is also just genuinely funny. Obviously, I can't really express it without just showing you, and that would risk copyright. But I will say that I love how the funniest moments seem to come from how drastically different our protagonists are. Tanya is a sick and twisted little girl. She sees allies as pawns and enemies as worse, while Ainz plays the role of Tanya's character, while in reality, he's a good-hearted person who is forced to play the role of his evil video game character Momonga. Subaru is a NEET who stepped up for someone he cared about, while Cosmo's a NEET who embodies laziness and is forced to babysit 3 incapable heroes. Add the shows that appear in later seasons and the mix only gets more interesting, with stern, cold heroes and wannabe Sasuke's. Okay, I've made my point. Before I go on repeating myself, I do want to end this video off with 3 of my favorite moments from the first 2 seasons. Both are tied to Youjo Senki and Overlord, as those are my favorite shows from the original 4. But don't worry, if you do like Konasuba and Re:Zero and you decide to watch Isekai Quartet yourself, you will find that there is plenty to love for those 2 as well. Okay, so firstly, there's this short but sweet scene that I really enjoy because of the little details. You see, at one point in time, Aqua tries to jump the floor guardians from Overlord as well as Ainz himself, and she uses a spell titled Turn Undead, which only affects undead enemies and tries to wipe them all out. However, only Shalltear and Ainz are actually affected. The reason for this is because in traditional means they are the only 2 that are actually undead. You see, Kakaitis is a vermin lord, which is basically the highest level of an insectoid, meaning he's a glorified bug. The twins are dark elves, and though they're called demons, Demiurge and Albedo are actually just another species within the world of Idrisil. They aren't actually from the afterlife. Unlike Shautir, who's actually a vampire, like the same kind of vampire you'd see in other forms of media. And then Ainz, who's an overlord, which is just the name of the highest level of an undead within Idrisil. However, this isn't even the best part. Mare, Cocytus, Demiurge, and Albedo are all immediately ready to attack. In such a minor moment, you see Ainz try to stop Mare, not Albedo, and none of the others. Albedo is the strongest person present outside of Ainz himself, arguably on either side, and yet that is not who Albedo chooses to stop. Instead, he stops Mare because Mare uses area of effect attacks. Everyone else would attack Aqua and it would only hurt Aqua, but of Mare, who I should mention I might be mispronouncing Mare's name, I actually don't know, sorry if I am.
Hi everyone, little editor note here. Mare is pronounced Mare in both the Japanese and the English versions of the show, but in audiobooks it's Mare. I tried looking online for a definite pronunciation because I received 2 audios with the different pronunciations. What I saw was pretty split 50-50, so I just went with Mare because I edited that first. If anyone gets really upset, you can fully blame me. It is not TehhKyu's fault. Might be you guys.
But his attacks actually hit quite a large range and would damage and maybe even destroy the neighborhood that they were currently presented in. Another scene, which is on the slower side but actually has some interesting character development, is how Tanya and Ainz interact with each other when they first meet. At first they try to befriend each other, with how strong Nazarick is and Overlord's main character Ainz being its strongest member. Tanya probably wanted them to be on her side and be useful allies, whereas Ainz likely literally just wanted a friend he could relate to within this new world, since it's such a foreign setting. That being said, Ainz will tell his allies that the reason why is so that he can hopefully get some help trying to understand the new world they're stuck in, since he is unable to do it on his own. However, the more they interact, and especially the more Ainz sees Tanya interact with her men and the other Youjo Senki characters, they start to drift apart. Though Tanya still talks to Ainz occasionally, Ainz starts to separate himself from Tanya more and more. And though it's never confirmed, a theory that a lot of people have, which I also had heard quite a bit before even doing research, was that the reason why is because Tanya treats her men like garbage, pawns that she uses on a whim for her own personal gain. However, to Ainz, the people of Nazarick are basically his children, with some of them literally being his kids. And the people that make up the Supreme Beings are like family to him. They may treat them the same, but whereas Tanya isn't playing a character, Ainz is. He pretends to be a good person, and Tanya is truly evil, and it sickens him. And that's why they chose to soon stop associating with each other. Hello. Okay, you're probably confused. Let me explain. First of all, if you watched the video up to this far, why not you think about subscribing, liking, all of that jazz. I'm going to be explaining some later lore within Overlord. No big plot twists, no big moments that happen within the story. Instead, I'll just simply be explaining what the real world is like within Overlord. Not Idrisil, but the world that the person who played Idrisil comes from. If you consider that to be too heavily spoiler territory and you choose to leave, I think that is fully understandable, and I hope you enjoyed the video up to this point, and I hope I was still able to make you enjoy the idea of watching Isekai Quartet. I do genuinely think it's worth at least giving it a try. And yeah. Finally, there's a short arc near the end of the story, and this is probably my favorite moment across the entire series. The talent arc is mostly a comedy scene. There's not really any surprise to that. However, with most people doing some pretty impressive stuff, it eventually has the attention shift towards Megumin from Konasuba, who intends to use her creatively named and definitely not just an explosion spell, Explosion, to show everyone up, and it works. Megumin is about to win, but then Ainz steps up. Ainz is about to tell a story about an experience he has when he was still a salaryman, before the New World and before he became a manga. And he performs the spell as he remembers his time as Suzuki Satoru, a Japanese businessman working in a world clouded by both pollution and smog. A world where it was necessary to wear a gas mask simply to leave your home. A world that doesn't experience snow anymore. And that's why he uses a spell, weather control, to create snow. He remembered back to another time, and the scene is quite interesting because though there are some funny little remarks, some cute little references, and some clear jokes present, Ainz himself is still and silent. The visuals do fade, and this episode has a completely new outro song that fit this new theme, this new sound, and it's more somber than anything that came before. Hollow Veil by Nanak, and it fits the tone perfectly, because this ending is not nearly as happy and as upbeat as you would expect from a comedy, because it's a story made by fans, and it clearly shows, and they wanted to cover more than just their laughs that could come from it. I think that's where I'm gonna end this video. I could sit here and talk about a bunch of different examples, but you should just watch the show for yourself. If you like any of the shows represented by Isekai Quartet, I do highly recommend giving it a try, and I do hope you enjoyed the video. What do you think? If you've seen Isekai Quartet, comment down below what your opinion on the series is, be it positive or negative, and thanks for watching. My name is TehhKyu, and I'll see you another time.